Thank you for coming to the first session of the Dissertation Club. My name is Ryan. I am the Learning Development Coordinator of the School of Business, Economics and Informatics. This Dissertation Club is an open space to discuss and explore the dissertation writing process. This is a place of respect and encouragement. We are all working together. Everybody here has a piece of the puzzle, so we can all contribute to this session. I hope you leave this session with some ideas of how to approach your dissertation. Discuss these ideas with your supervisor. As I stated in the email, your supervisor's guidance is paramount. Always refer to them. This session is being recorded. You will find it on the BEI Study Skills Moodle page and on the YouTube channel, Academic Carnival. We are joined by Meredith Jones, who will take us through her excellent dissertation on gender inequality in British advertising agencies. We are very fortunate to have her here with us today. I became aware of Mary's work through Euracha congratulating Mary on winning the Postgraduate Award. So I reached out to Mary just for a 10-minute phone call, but the conversation lasted over an hour. I learned so much. Mary raised such interesting points. I hope we can replicate some of that discussion today. I will moderate this session, so feel free to ask questions in the chat or click on the raise your hand icon. Mary, anytime you're ready.
Thanks, Ryan. That's brilliant. So thanks everyone for joining this. Hopefully you'll find it useful. It's an interesting exercise, sort of thinking about how you might share 10,000 words. So don't worry, I'm not going to talk through all of them. But yes, this was my sort of dissertation, and all this stuff at the front is in the guidance about how you can go about constructing your document before you submit it. This is how I structured my contents. It varies. I mean, we'll talk a little bit about structure, but it's there are some decisions that you yourself can make as the person doing the research. In terms of my abstract, Ryan suggested a structure that I'm going to work to, so I won't dwell on this particularly. I think, you know, as with any essay, the abstract tends to be the thing you write last, because effectively it's the summary of the document that you've written. So I think before I talk about the introduction, actually Ryan asked me just to talk about generally about research and the research question, and you'll have seen my title was Hidden in Plain Sight. And I think it's an important process where actually before you even get as far as articulating your question, there's the topic that you have to decide upon in your abstract, and then the proposal that you have to write first. You know, there's a lot of guidance on this from the organisational psychology department, and there's different ways that you can do it. You know, obviously one way is a gap in the literature. In my case, it was more of a problematization. It happened that there was a big expose in The Guardian about advertising, which was an industry I worked in for quite some time. I was already aware that there were issues with diversity and equality in the industry that were quite long-standing. And I already knew that I was going to research in that industry because it was one that I was familiar with. I knew I would be able to recruit participants. I think it's also worth saying that when you recruit in an industry and you work with research in industry that you know, you also bring subjectivity and your own bias, and you have to be aware of that in your reflexivity when you're researching and when you're developing your questions and thinking about how you structure your research. But it certainly made it easier for me when I was looking to access participants for my interviews. So in my case, there was this bit of journalism. I was also reading the book Invisible Women at the time, which showed how gender inequality can be sort of very hardwired into our society in all sorts of ways, in policy, in language, in things that we take for granted day to day. And all of these things got me thinking, I suppose, that it would be a really interesting topic to discuss, because when I went to look at the data around the industry, it suggested that there is a good gender balance in the advertising industry in Britain, and that about half of the workforce are women. And yet, you know, I knew from people and that I had worked with from this bit of journalism as well, and that there were, you know, it wasn't what it might appear to be, and that although people might be present, that isn't the same as being treated equally or being treated fairly. So that was kind of how I decided to focus on my topic. And I think, the one thing to say about that obviously is that grey literature can be a really inspiring source, but then obviously you have to go on and ensure that you've grounded your thinking and your work in a really rigorous literature review. I think the benefit of journalism, it's very, it's contemporary, it's immediate, it highlights something that the academic literature might not have caught up with yet, because of the time lag around publication and research, but you do then have to go and ensure that there's a, what does the literature say around this topic. Fortunately, literature has a lot to say about gender equality, so that was quite handy. Just thinking what next. So I think the other thing when I was looking at my research question was that I knew that I was really interested, because inequality in large part is socially constructed, and I knew that I was really, really interested in how the role that language plays in that. And so I was really interested in doing a discursive study. So that was another thing that sort of influenced my question. So I suppose I would say that I don't think I didn't find it was a very sort of linear process. I think that I found I was thinking about these things at the same time and connecting them together as I went, and I did all of my reading. And then it started to kind of come together to formulate a question. I think the other thing is that, this is where your supervisor can be immensely helpful. So I think I didn't find it hard to get to the area that I was interested in, but when I was articulating the question, my supervisor, Archer, was really, really helpful, and she gave me some good advice about that. And I think the best thing is that keeping it quite simple is the best advice I can give. And therefore my question was, how do women talk about gender equality in communications agencies, with the key being how do they talk about it? So how do they construct their view of equality today based upon their lived experiences of working in that industry? Looking at the introduction and rationale, this was probably the easiest bit for me. And again, this is very subjective, but I got a good grade for my proposal, and I'd done quite a lot of work for the introduction in my proposal. So I took quite a bit of it, and you can reuse your proposal in your dissertation, which is delightful, because it means you don't have to write more new words. So I think I don't want to spend sort of too long on this, because I do think it is probably one of the most straightforward parts. In the end, you're setting up your argument and setting up your question, and most importantly, explaining why it matters. Like, why should anyone care about this topic that you're going to be researching? And so for me, this is where I highlighted what I was interested in, what the data told me about gender equality in the UK, what the data about the industry told me, how issues with inequality had been highlighted in different areas like journalism, and that made it topical and interesting. And I also then used it to, very importantly, towards the end, the last thing I did was to use it to explain how my dissertation was structured. And I'm sure you've all been given guidance on this about your essays as well, is just signpost to the reader where you're going at every possible stage. Just signpost, give them headings, hold their hand, be really clear about how everything you're writing answers your research question at every stage. And I think if you do that, then you're kind of onto a winner. So I think the other thing to say about this is it's also worth thinking, some good advice I was given about how to make it an interesting read, as well as a knowledgeable one, or one well rooted in the research. And I think there's something in there about your own sort of authorial voice. Obviously, you can write in the first person in your dissertation, which you can't in your essay. And I think for me, I sort of drew, in my introduction, before I got into the literature review and the academic work, I drew on quite a range of other sources as well that I thought kind of provided interesting context for the issue. So for example, to give one example here, a website had been set up called Dear Adlan, where women were going online sharing anonymous testimonials about all the terrible things they'd experienced in the industry by way of gender inequality, which obviously they didn't feel confident or comfortable sharing with their organisations. And so all of these things kind of went into that introduction. I think spend more time on the literature review because this is just so important and it's such a rigorous part of the work that you do. Ryan asked me about the sources I used. Catastrophically, I couldn't actually access the library. Nobody could because of COVID, because we were the first cohort of students who were sort of in the lockdown. But the online library is fabulous, as I'm sure you all know, and the sort of database of online articles is really good. And I also use Google Scholar extensively and kind of cross-reference the two. I think one of the things that it's worth bearing in mind is that you can order articles that the library doesn't have, and I did that on several occasions, and that was a really fast turnaround service and was really helpful. And I also invested in a couple of other research books around methods just to help myself. The research textbook that certainly when I started the course, the research methods handbook has some really good stuff in there about methods, which I actually revisited, found that really useful. And I also put an interesting book called Introducing Qualitative Research in Psychology by Carla Willig, who has some really nice worked examples of how to do things like thematic analysis and discourse analysis, which is what I ended up using. So with the review, I mean, obviously, this is about framing your own research question and showing, that you understand what has gone before. It forms the context for your own work and how you're adding to theory and knowledge. And it's also the sort of source of your theoretical framework. So it helps with identifying how you want to research your topic. I think it's always a good idea to start with the definition of the topic, which I'm sure is something you've all been told numerous times when you've been writing essays. So it's because, for example, if you're writing about employee engagement, I think there are over 50 definitions of what engagement is. There are many definitions of motivation, for example. So, I gave a very specific definition of what I meant by inequality that I drew from the literature.
Mary, we have a question from Linda. Linda said, what book did you use again for your analysis? You mentioned a particular book.
I can send it to you, Ryan. It was a book called Introducing Qualitative Research in Psychology, and it's by a lady called Carla Willig, which is Willig. Ryan, I can send you the details. But actually, the Principles of Applied Research Methods, which was the set textbook for research methods, also has some really good stuff in there about paradigms, about doing your literature review, about methods. And I actually, if you go back through that, I personally found that really helpful as well, just as a refresher when I actually came to write the dissertation.
That's excellent. And for our ask, could you write down the books that you use? I assume we can look at your bibliography at the end. Rough story.
Yeah, it's all in there. It's all in there. And I can send you the titles anyway to share with people afterwards, if that's helpful.
That'll be great. Thank you, Mary. Yeah.
Marvelous. Shall I continue?
Yeah. Go ahead, Mary. Thank you.
Great. So I think here I was, at the start of one of the things I tried to do in each section is to give it a really clear sort of intro to each section and a summary at the end as well. And that was something I got quite good feedback for when I got my grade. So I was really clear about how I created a framework for my literature review. I made a note of all my search terms. So I was clear in my own mind what the boundaries of my search were, and how I went about kind of looking for the articles I was interested in. And often, of course, as I'm sure you all know, one article leads to another. So if you read one good paper, and you look at the references, it will often then lead you to another good paper. So I found that a really kind of helpful approach. I think it's really important to say that it's not just a summary. I think it's worth bearing in mind that it has to be a critical review, which I found quite intimidating at the start, because I think what I found helped is telling myself that I was you're doing an academic piece of research. And I think you sort of have to shift out of the mindset of being a student where you're learning. And for me, I found it helpful to think, okay, this is my research and I've got to treat it as I would do if I were writing something for publication, and think about being an academic researcher. And that means that as you're going through, it's not just that, you know, you're paraphrasing what other academics have said, but that you're also taking a view on that research, and perhaps, you know, its relative strengths or weaknesses. You know, it could be that there's more quantitative research than there is qualitative research in the field. It could be, you know, that there are some limitations in the research that has gone before, you know, for example. It just depends upon the topic that you're doing. What else can I tell you? And I think it's also important that when you structure the review, it starts building towards your argument, because in the end, this is, you know, you're making an argument that is the grounds for the merit of your research question, the research that you're going to do. So for me, I was sort of gradually building this argument around what the historical context of gender roles within advertising were, that there was a shift in that there was some interesting research in that space. That women in certain roles in advertising were under-researched. So it turned out there was a big focus on people in creative roles within advertising agencies, and very little about women in a very big department called client services, which has some quite big issues with inequality even now. And so this is kind of how I started building up the structure of my review. And I, as you can see, I then started through the different articles looking at the different aspects of how, you know, the different papers around inequality specifically with the industry, but then also, you know, some more broadly around, for example, I also looked at inequality in other service industries and also in other creative industries. So I guess there's a thing that's what I mean by kind of almost deciding on the framework for your literature review, which is what is relevant to your research question. You know, how does it help you understand what's gone before, and how will it help you construct the research you want to, you know, to then go and do in order to answer the question. And then the other thing, obviously, so to give you an example of a limitation, you know, Alverson, who is a remarkable academic and has written lots of wonderful papers, did a really interesting piece of work in a Swedish agency, but my view was that, you know, it's only a Swedish agency, and that's a very small market in the context of the advertising industry, and it was also a very long time ago. So things could have changed quite significantly since then in terms of his conclusions. It was also quite a male biased article in my view, so I highlighted that in terms of it being a sort of a more critical view of that work, which is slightly scary when you do it, because, you know, this is a person who has published multiple articles and I hadn't done anything. But, you know, that's the way I think you have to kind of go about, you know, constructing your own piece of work. And then the other thing, obviously, is that as I started to review all the papers, the other thing that was happening was I was starting to see the big theories that were appearing in the literature. And they formed the basis of my theoretical framework, which was predominantly Acker's work on inequality regimes, because the more I read, the more her work appeared, and her work on gendered organisations. And I started to think to myself, that's very interesting. You know, could advertising agencies be inequality regimes, even though people might not perceive them to be that? And so that sort of formed my overarching theoretical framework, also informed by, I was also interested in intersectionality and the differences that people have depending on different personal characteristics, as well as being a woman. And that includes kind of age and race, maternal status, for example, is a big one. So that's broadly how I got to my theoretical framework, which I then summed up at the end of this section. So I kind of brought it together in a nice kind of, here are all the things I've reviewed, and this is what I've decided will be the theory that I'm going to use to guide my research and to explore it. Does that all make sense, or has anyone got any questions at this point?
Oh, no questions at this point. No
No.
question.
I think the other thing. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Somebody remarked earlier about the range of sources that you're using from like newspapers, TV. It's like very interesting about the range of sources as well. I think this was related to your introduction as well. This related to your introduction.
Yeah, and I think I thought to myself, what makes this topic interesting? And for me, that's the fact that you look at something like Mad Men, which is hugely popular, which presents an image of advertising in the 50s, which was, it's largely true. That wasn't just a TV program. That was what it was like, and that way of working existed for a really long time, right the way into the 90s when I first started my career. And it would be hard to believe sometimes that you were in a workplace, and sometimes that's fun in advertising, and sometimes it's also undermining for certain aspects of working life. And I would say that equality is definitely one of those. So I did, but I think the important thing is that that you can include all of those, but obviously I balanced it with a really quite extensive literature review as well. I think the one thing I would also say I really learned from the literature was not just to look at the content, but to look at the way they're structured. And this might sound obvious, but I think when you're actually looking to write your own dissertation, looking at how academics signpost their argument through headings and subheadings, how they decide to weight each section in terms of the relative length of each one, how they continually highlight how they're answering their question. It's all really helpful, because I think when I started reading articles, I was so busy trying to get my head around what they meant and to understand some of them, because some of them are quite complicated, that you tend to sail past the structure. But actually you can learn a lot from the way that they actually go about writing and the style that they use, as well as the actual academic learning in there as well. So that would be.
That's great. So I've got two excellent questions. One from Jackie. She says, did you have a linear approach to the study, or did you go back to the literature review after you did your interviews?
No, I went back to my literature review and I added to it. And I think that's really important, that you can add to it afterwards, because research to me is not a linear process. It's an iterative process, because invariably you may not end up where you thought you would. You might not find what you thought you would find. I think it's really important to say that you can change your research question after you've done your research. So even as long as you justify why it's changed and you agree that with your supervisor, really importantly, and you have that conversation, obviously. What a friend of mine changed her question because something that came out of her research was so intriguing that she wanted to focus on that instead, and it just wasn't something that she expected to get back from her participants. And so it was a derivation of where she started, but it was a different question. And then so she also then had to go back and look at some slightly different literature, and I did that as well. Went back and just looked for a few more articles that would help me dig a little bit deeper into some of the findings that I had and make sure that I'd done my best to understand them. So I would say definitely iterative, and that I was kind of moving backwards and forwards through my dissertation all the time, right up until I submitted it, that I was constantly honing, refining, rewording, tightening. Can I say this in fewer words? Can I make it more elegantly articulated? How can I land my ideas and my thoughts in the most powerful, persuasive, interesting way? So I think there is a thing about thinking not just about the content, but the style of your writing as well.
Okay, and we have two more questions. Marie said, in the literature review, is there a storyline or a narrative, or is it more exploration of different aspects of your topic without really linking them yet?
I would say that for me, like, that's what I meant by an argument. There was more of a storyline. So as I moved through the research, I was conscious that I was building a storyline and I was moving. So I connected them as I went. So I'm trying to find, let me find you an example here. So here I talked about Alverson's view and the fact that femininity in the industry doesn't favour women, and that it's actually subverted by men in their favour. And that was his sort of conclusion. And that he demonstrated how gender equality is complicated by a fluidity of gender, where the work itself that you do in advertising can be perceived as quite feminized. but that it's men in that work, and then that affects men's behaviour. And then I went on, for example, to then link that into another theory written by Maven, which was around female misogyny, which is where women start to behave like men. And so there's like a sort of mirror image there in the academic research. And she found that there was a complexity for women where they become male to fit their management role. So people's behaviours, there was research in different places around how both men and women, or sort of biological men and women, I suppose, then sort of the difference between sex and gender, I suppose, and gender as a social construct associated with certain socially constructed behaviours, and people then shifting between these things. And so this is so then I went on to sort of again then move into these behaviours, such behaviours, as well as being aspects of identity work, could also be a manifestation of organisational politics. So as I went through at every step of my review, if you were to read the whole thing, don't do that, that I was constantly sort of building a storyline and connecting each section, and sort of, yeah, if that kind of makes sense, because that's just how it made most sense to me. And sometimes you have to kind of make a segue from, not everything links really neatly, but you then just have to make a sort of elegant break and find a connecting thought. So from that section I went on to talk about organisations as being inherently gendered. So although that's a slightly different thought, it was connected through the idea of gender and how gender in the industry plays out. I hope that makes sense.
That's great. And last question from Tahani. If I found a different result, should I change my literature review? I think that's a conversation you need to have with your supervisor. But Mary, could you touch on that? Like, if her result changed, should she change her literature review?
I mean, yeah, I would agree. Definitely a conversation with your supervisor. I mean, I think if it was wildly different, if you want to write about something completely different and the literature that you've got is no longer relevant, then I would suspect, yes, you would need to. I mean, in my case, the review I'd done kind of, was in the main still directly relevant to what I found in the industry. So I think it does depend upon how much your findings vary, to be honest, and it's sort of hard for me to advise you there. I think that would be one for your supervisor, but I think your literature review has to connect to your research, your research, your findings. It all has to hang together. So you can't have the front end not match the back end. You have to kind of navigate your way through that. So I would assume that if you have decided to write about something completely different to what you thought you would at the outset, then you would need to, because I mean, your theoretical framework might need to be slightly different. For example, you might need to go and look for a different theory to explain what you're seeing in your findings. Does that help?
Excellent, that's brilliant. And you guys as well, you can raise your hand and ask your question like vocally. You don't have to write in the chat section as well. But thank you, that was very clear. That was very clear.
I mean, I'm really conscious that this stuff is not easy, but nor is it impossible. And I think when I started, I think it can feel overwhelming to begin with, but the more you read and the more you write, just the easier it gets. And I think it's also about how you yourself study and write. For me, I work quite iteratively, so I often like to write something and then leave it and then come back to it, and then I often have a bit of a sort of brainwave because my brain has been mulling it over, and I've got the sort of sad brain that doesn't really switch off. So there were times when I would wake up in the middle of the night and write something down because it just come into my head in the middle of the night. And so I always had a notebook on me because I was constantly kind of scribbling ideas as I went and thoughts. And I think that's, for me, it was very much a sort of iterative thought process, really, like a really intense process of thinking, and then through that process the writing becomes easier. I think the other thing I would say is it's really great to have a critical friend. So I had someone who read this for me several times who didn't know the first thing about organisational psychology or what I was writing about, but was a very good writer, and therefore was very good at asking me things to ensure that my argument was clear, or make observations where he didn't think the structure quite worked, or so he was very good, even though he didn't understand, in many ways actually better, because he didn't understand the content, because really what he looked at was the way it was put together, and did it sort of make sense in that context, as opposed to is it meaningful to me. If that helps, I hope it helps.
Excellent answer. Mr. Forlow, you have to come to the mic, please. That's the whole novel. Please, well, would that be okay?
Yeah.
Glyn? Thank you, Glyn.
I'm a little bit worried it might be beyond the scope of what we're talking about.
No. The question is very interesting, but I just want to make sure that I don't misinterpret it. But I think the question is very interesting. Please, Glyn.
Okay.
That'll be great.
I'll give it a go. So Mary, it was something you said about trying to make your ideas land, and something that I often try and do is basically pinch stuff from clever people. Quotes from, I put one in the chat as an example. If I was going to maybe talk about lack of ethics at the top of organisations, then I might use a quote from Bertrand Russell: "Life is nothing but a competition to be the criminal rather than the victim." And that would use my section or my paragraph or my chapter, and then I would discuss how there's lots of unethical behaviour at the top of organisations and that kind of thing. So that I get away with that in essays for the most part. Would I get away with that in a dissertation, or is it too?
I would say yes, because in my dissertation, my equivalent is, my first degree was in literature. So whenever I'm thinking about anything, I often think about things that I read in literature, which is a very broad topic, and involves all sorts of people. And so I referred to Simone de Beauvoir here, for example, not an organizational psychologist, but she did write a really important book about discrimination against women. And I think what's important there is that obviously you ensure you've put it in your references and you don't claim it as your own. But the other thing is, I think that's what I meant by saying I put these in and there was no issue with it, but it was because it was surrounded by a really, really rigorous literature review, which was, which covered a lot of ground. In the same way, I think in my introduction, I made a reference to Wollstonecraft, actually, back in 1795, who wrote Vindication of the Rights of Women. So, I included, yes, a whole array of sources that I found interesting. To me, they were setting the context for the evolution of equality or inequality for women in the UK, and then I drilled down into what that meant in the advertising industry that I was looking at. But invariably, because equality and inequality are about power, and power is often established over time and in history, that's kind of what I was interested in. That's the argument that I took. So, look, I also referred to invisible women, as I said. So, and I looked at government evidence as well. I looked at the government's roadmap for achieving equality. That was an interesting read. So I would say definitely. But you see, if you look at where I put these sources in, and I talked about Mad Men, but I also talked about gender and organisational studies, and I wove this mix of sources together. And then I had all of the industry data here as well, which looked at kind of where women are in the workplace, and still very few people at the top. So in my view, I would say definitely yes, as long as you ensure that you have a really, really robust academic literature review. Because that certainly seems to work for me.
No, that's great. You've really answered my question, and I might be pinching power is established over time and over history from you, because that's quite a good one as well.
Oh, lovely. My first quotation. How exciting.
Yes, Bertrand Russell and you're in the same league as my book.
So marvellous. I mean, also here, I looked at Procter & Gamble, that the chief executive of Procter & Gamble made some statements that arguably had a really negative effect on women in the industry. So I put that in as well, because these things are interesting and they're relevant and they're useful. And I think it's about them being relevant and useful, as well as it's accompanied by the academic work, because when you're looking at some of these issues, kind of need both to understand what's happening right now on the ground in that workplace, as well as the academic work, which is invaluable, but often, you know, the most recent paper you're going to find is 2 years old, and that's just about, you know, a lag in publication, I think, you know. So so yes, so shall I carry on?
Yeah, I've got a quick question for Anna. So
Yeah.
Anna was saying, what if there is no existing theory to frame your research question? Can you develop your own? I would look towards grounded theory in terms of methodology and having that discussion with your supervisor.
Yeah,
but also,
really,
there's going to be something. It's going to be some background, some overlapping theory somehow. And Mary, would you like to add anything to that?
I would say it's really unusual there's no theory.
Yeah.
And then I would really strongly say have a chat with your supervisor about that, because it could be that you just haven't found it yet, or that you need to think a bit laterally about how a theory applies to your subject matter. I mean, if it's really, I mean, yeah, sometimes, I mean, obviously we're dealing with mid-level theory in our land of organisational psychology, but there is always room for theoretical development. Of course there is. I mean, I would have loved to have been able to add theory, but that is the big ask. If you have got something where genuinely there is space for new theory, then talk to your supervisor about it. They'll probably be wildly excited. But yes, you do need to make sure, as Ryan says, that there really isn't anything that's out there already, because obviously a huge amount has been written theoretically, and often we're kind of adding to it and refining it and developing it, or challenging it. But that doesn't mean there isn't space, you know, of course, for new theories, because things change all the time. So I think if you think you have got something, then that's definitely a conversation for your supervisor. I mean, what I would say about this is, in many ways, this becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because my research question, when you've developed your question and you've articulated it, it starts to suggest a certain type of research, both the methodology, you know, in terms of your overall approach, your overall strategy to your research, and then your methods, so actually the things that you do. So for me, you know, because my question was about how do people talk about something, my research question dictated a critical qualitative approach, and it was within the social constructionist paradigm, where, you know, there is no one truth but different truths born of different experiences. And so, you know, I think that there is like an internal logic to research where certain things fit together quite nicely. And then it becomes a little bit more complicated when you then have to make choices about exactly how you're going to do things. So for me, then it was about, you know, my method, and particularly my biggest decision was about my analysis. And again, this will really vary depending upon whether you're doing quant or qual, or whether you're, you know, yeah, what paradigm you choose to operate within. And then also, you know, for example, you know, are you doing critical research, or, you know, phenomenological research, you know, so all these, but all these things do tend to have their internal logics and kind of rules that about what you can and can't do within them. And that's why the research question is so important, because it guides you in the right direction, and then you have to make some choices as you go. So for me, my methodology was pretty straightforward. My sample was pretty straightforward, which I've touched on already, so I won't talk about in that any great detail. Had quite a nice little table in there. Tables don't count in the word count, so as long as they're not gratuitous tables, it's quite a nice way to present lots of data. So this is my sample. I did 17 interviews. That's a lot. I would really think about how many you do. Interestingly, if you have more interviews than, if you do qual and you do interviews and you have more data than you need, you don't have to use all of it. I didn't know that to start off with, but it was helpful when I knew I didn't have to, because I did have a hell of a lot of data by the end of this. And I just, you know, and here you've got all the standard stuff you need to write about how you went about recruiting people, how you complied with ethical guidance. You know, I put something in there about COVID because it was remiss not to. But the really important thing here, so I decided to do semi-structured interviews to allow enough flexibility for people to talk to me. I wanted to say as little as possible because I wanted to hear what they had to say. So I just had enough questions to kind of prod them occasionally. And I also used some provocations, and these were a series of statements that I developed from the literature, from the journalism, and they were all, yeah, quite provocative sort of things which were designed to, and I, in advance of the interviews, I asked people to pick 3 that had resonated with them for some reason, whether they agreed, whether they disagreed, whether they didn't understand it, whatever. I just said, pick 3, don't overthink it, just come and be prepared to talk about these a little bit during our chat. And so then I had a little section on data collection. I think importantly here about how I went, I think there's a really important thing here if you're doing qual about data saturation, and there's very different views on this. There are loads of papers out there about how many interviews you need in qualitative research to be to have enough, I guess, and it's a very vexed subject about should qual even really be bothered about how many, isn't that a quant question? So Braun and Clark here challenge that concept, and I sort of put some stuff in there about that because it's quite helpful when it comes to the limitations section. And the biggest thing for me, this is my big decision. So I knew I wanted to do discourse analysis. There are different forms. For those of you interested in discourse analysis, there's kind of, very simply put, there's the sort of more hardcore linguistic end, like Fairclough, which is about the individual weight of specific words, and then there's at the other end of the spectrum, there's the kind of Foucauldian analysis, which is about I guess what the text tells us about the context and what it tells us about power and relations of power, and that these aren't kind of opposites, they're on a spectrum, and it's really important to understand that. So I basically, because I'd chosen discourse analysis, I had to go and do a hell of a lot of extra reading around discourse analysis in order to choose a type of analysis and then understand what that was and how to use it. I'm glad I did it now. At the time, I thought it might kill me, so I wouldn't say don't do it. I would say be mindful of the fact if you choose a method of analysis that's a bit more complicated. I wanted to do this because I hadn't done it before. I had worked in research previously. I knew how to do thematic analysis. So part of this was for my own good, for my own learning, but also because I really felt that it was the right analysis to best answer my question and to best analyze the data that I had collected from people. And I thought so that's why I chose it. But I wouldn't say it was easy, because there is no academic consensus about how to do Foucauldian discourse analysis. There are just different approaches to doing it. And I chose one when I'd read them, which was the one that I thought was the clearest and the most suitable for the data that I had. And then I really clearly explained why I had chosen it, and I did my own little summary of what it is. And so there are sort of 6 elements to kind of conducting this analysis. And then also, really importantly, there's a thing about how FDA refuses formalization, and therefore I didn't laboriously slog through every single one of these elements when I wrote up my findings. I wrote about the ones that were the most important in my view based upon my findings. So although I did this full analysis, which I'll show you in a minute, I didn't kind of write in detail about all of them, because I would have had, a PhD by the end of that, I think. So a little bit on reflexivity, really, really important, because, you adopt a position of power in interviews, you are asking the questions, that has an influence on the people you research with. So, and also I was interviewing in my own industry. So again, I bring subjectivity to that. So I have to think about that. And then findings, I had sort of broad introduction, and again, big decision for me, and will be one for you. That the department, well, certainly when I studied, they suggested a structure and a kind of how long each section might be. I think this is really down to you based upon what you find. I needed a lot of words for my findings and my discussion because it was so rich, and therefore I worked really, really hard to make the other parts of my dissertation really efficient in terms of how I used the word count, in order to give me more time here to talk about what I found, because I really wanted to do justice to the voices of the people that I interviewed. It was very important to me that these people were heard. And some really good advice I was given was to choose no more than 3 things to write about. So whether they're themes or, in my case, discursive constructs. I sort of picked 3, which is really hard because I had so much to write about. And it was a tough decision, but I did get to my 3. And of course, it makes, again, you should be thinking about, how do these answer my research question? Are these the most important things in the context of that question and the literature? And how does it help kind of answer the argument that I've set up earlier on in this dissertation? So I had done a nice little table of my different elements that I went through and identified. I won't talk through that here because it's quite detailed and it took a bit of time. I actually found another student who was doing FDA on the course, and she and I were a sounding board for each other when we were doing our analysis, which was really, really helpful. So I'd recommend that if you have the opportunity to do so, because it just, when you're both learning something together, you can question each other, and that was really, really helpful. And then the way I wrote my themes up, so here they were to do with organizational structure and predetermined subservience. I wrote about identity and intersectionality, and I wrote about patriarchy and the dismantling of equality, by which I meant that by the end of the interviews, women were sort of challenging the whole linguistic concept of equality as being insufficient for the issue, which was quite interesting. And so I then wrote sort of longhand about these constructs, and I included verbatims, very powerful things when you're writing qualitative. Had to be very selective about the ones I picked and how I used them. And then the other really important thing, again, here with your findings, is your findings need to be critical. They can't just report back what you found. You need to make some observations about them. And that was another really great bit of advice I was given by your Archer. Don't just summarize or relay back. Make, comment on what you found, kind of make some observations based upon everything you've learned and read. So, here Nina was talking about the fact that there's loads of women in the industry, but at the top it's all men. Where have they all come from? And she, in that conversation, she was drawing on discourses of power and history, and she used the word traditional for men to be in charge. And so, this was me kind of commenting as I go through, and I did that sort of as I went through. And as you can see, this is a long section, so I used a lot of my words here, but it was really important because I couldn't, really, have done it in any less and done justice to the topic. So this is where I've done all of this, and then I got to a little end of the summary where, as I said, ultimately participants began to dismantle the concept of equality as a reductive term, and that we needed a new discourse to kind of achieve equality in future. What else can I tell you about that? And I think that's, so that's how I approached it. I don't know if there are any questions about that. Okay. And then obviously your findings and your discussion very closely related things. I like the discussion. I really enjoyed writing the finding and discussion section, even though it was quite tough. But by then, you've done your analysis. I did all my own transcription. I would believe what everybody tells you about how long transcription takes. It's really long. The great thing about doing it yourself is you're really familiar with your data by the time you finish, but it takes a long time. And I would strongly suggest, if you're going to do it yourself, you buy a transcription pedal and download the free software to go with it, which means you can play back your recordings with your feet while you type, because otherwise, it will just kill you. So definitely do that. And then in terms of the discussion, sort of quite simply, this is about placing your findings within the context that you've discussed and the literature you've researched. And in my case, it was a question of linking the way in which participants constructed the issue of inequality in different ways to the theoretical framework in the literature I reviewed. So that's what the discussion section did for me. And then through that, I was also suggesting ways in which my research was adding to theory and knowledge. So, for example, there was no Foucauldian discourse analysis in this space. So I suggest in the section that this was a way that I was making a contribution. I talked about the participants being very sophisticated communicators. So they're people who use language for a living. So they are aware of the fact that they're constructing information as they're talking to me. So they're probably far more self-aware in that way than many people might be. And so I'm talking here as I'm going through, all talking back to the findings again, so, you know, back to what I've just reported in terms of the findings section, but then playing it back to the literature and connecting it all the way through to the argument that I've made as I've gone, bringing it back to Foucault, bringing it back to Gill, bringing it back to Acker, and just connecting the two and kind of playing back to my own argument that I've been, my storyline, my narrative as I've been going.
What separated your findings from your discussion section? Like, what was the aim of your findings section, and what was the aim of your discussion section?
Well, I suppose the aim of your findings is to very clearly present your analysis of the data that you have collected. And as I said, though, you also need to make some observations about that as you report it back, whereas the discussion links it really, really clearly back to your literature review and the research that has gone before. And that to me was the difference. I mean, it's all everything you should be writing should be critical, and I think it's really important to understand that word critical, which is you know, to ensure that you're, you know, making your own observations and thoughts about things, not just kind of summarizing what other people have done. Yeah. And so I think really, you know, that's pretty much it. I think for me, because again, I'd made a decision about the way I structured my findings and discussion, and I put a lot of the word count into them, and that was not without risk. I was a bit nervous about doing it at the time, but I thought, well, this is my research. I understand it. This is what I think is important and what I need to do to answer my question. So that was a decision that I took, which fortunately went well. And then at the end of my discussion, I was really clear about what I thought my 3 contributions were. I mean, it could be any number of contributions, but it just felt like, you know, I thought I had 3, and that's what I wanted to really drive home to people. And also that I thought that, you know, there was a great quote from one of my participants that the ad agencies were built by men for men. And I felt that was a manifestation of the theory of inequality regimes kind of in action. And then so by then actually, and you often see this in academic papers, that my conclusion was actually really short, because in large part I'd already kind of made my argument. So this was very much a wrap up. Some people write longer conclusions but have a shorter discussion, and I think it really does depend upon your own research. But for me, this was very much like a short paragraph summarizing what had gone before. And then I used that to set up my recommendations for where future research could go off the back of what I found, which was very much about the difference between, you know, it's not just about men and women, it's actually about masculine and feminine, and it's about gendered professions and the history of gendering in this industry, and the fluidity of gendering, and the impact that has on people in the different roles they occupy in the industry, and that often, you know, people don't blame men or blame women. It's actually, you know, to do with these social constructs, which is really interesting, and the language that supports them, and perpetuates the belief that, you know, certain attributes are what you need to be a leader, but they're words that are very associated with masculinity, for example. And so I used the rest of my conclusion just to sum up where I thought the research could go, and then a little sort of summary at the end. And then obviously you always have to have some limitations, you know, qual will always have its limitation of being qual. I think one of the interesting things that I was advised to do when you're writing your limitations is to kind of go, yes, it's a limitation, but within the scope and ambition for the piece of research, it's kind of not a limitation, because it is what it is. You know what I mean? It doesn't hold an ambition to be something more than it is. But, you know, for me, obviously, you know, it would have been really interesting to do a longitudinal approach. It could be interesting to do a mixed method approach where you go and actually put some numbers on the views that I discovered. You know, anything like that could be interesting. And then I also did a little bit on dissemination at the end, and because it was a very, you know, it was, you know, a very practitioner-based piece of research, very empirical. I wrote a little bit about how I thought it could be of use to the industry, that I had worked in, and that was my dissertation. And then all of my references, and then the critical review, which is not marked. It doesn't contribute to your grade, but it is mandatory. And it's very much to show about what did you learn through the process of doing your research. You know, what did you learn? What did you gain from it? What might you have done differently? And yeah, that's the purpose of the review. So as I said, not graded, but an important exercise. And that was it.
So to sum up, there's the finding section, the analysis section, conclusion, and recommendation, and that's it. That's like the last sections of your dissertation. Is Marie right in that?
In terms of my structure,
yeah, the last sections.
So my structure was, and how I sort of combined them. And I do really think that splitting out these things really, although it's words, like for example, being really clear in your research section, because your research section has a lot in it, you know, just because you have to talk about each bit of it. So for me, although I had like, sorry, I'm conscious I'm scrolling here and it's probably sending your eyes crazy. So under this bit about the whole research approach, if you like, strategy, I had this bit on ontology and epistemology. Actually, let me go to the contents page, because that's just an easier way for you to see what my structure was, because you can see it on the page. So this was my structure. That's how I did it. Some people did differently. Some people combined their findings and their discussion. Some people combine their discussion and conclusion. This is just, as I said, I wrote quite an extensive findings and discussion section. So my conclusion could be quite succinct and kind of include recommendations about what the industry might do to address these problems that they have. And then, you know, you have all of your, I mean, and it's very, very down to you what you include in your appendices. Nothing should go in the appendices that you definitely want someone to read, because they might not read it. And all this guidance is in the research handbook, so it is all there. It was when I did it anyway. But I included an overview of agency structure, so anyone reading it who didn't work in advertising had a clue about what I was writing about. I did put a brief description in the dissertation itself, but obviously, you know, you're not going to put a huge thing in there. So I actually did an organogram. Like I said, my search framework, how I went about organising myself in terms of my research. And then obviously all the forms from your ethics have to go in there. They do ask for those to be featured. So all of the paperwork that you use. Yeah, and I actually kept a research diary as well, which actually can be really useful. So like I said, I had my sort of notebook about all my ideas, and that really helped me get to the constructs that I wanted to write about. I had endless little diagrams about how I thought they kind of worked together and sat together. And I found that a really useful process. So you've kind of, you know, got something to scribble as your thoughts develop, and you make notes as you read papers and things, and you know, you extract the kind of key thoughts from them.
Thank you, Mary. Really, really appreciate that. I'm sure everybody else is very happy with what we heard, and we have some ideas of how to approach our own study. Thank you. Really appreciate that. A round of applause for Mary, everybody.
I wish everyone the very best of luck, and you will all get there. You know, I think there are always times where you think you won't, but you absolutely will, and you'll feel fantastic when you have finished it.
So, and I